Good morning, grade 9s, and welcome to Quarantine English with Mr. Fouché. As you can see, today's setup is slightly different. We've got a bigger board, which will help a lot. So, let's get started with today's topic, or what we'll be doing today. And today's lesson is going to draw a lot from the previous lesson, the elements of a story. But this time, we'll be using Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is the novel you'll be doing this year, or that you are already doing, I hope. And we'll be using that and finding the different elements to the story itself. Now you should know that there are 5 of these. You've got your characters, the setting, theme, tone, and then lastly your plot. We will not be talking about plot today. We will discuss plot as an entire topic on its own in the next video. So for today, only the first 4 that we'll focus on. Some of you might have already done some summaries about your novel, because I think Mrs. Heron about a month ago gave you a task where you can find all these different things. So you can take those papers and then just cross-reference them and find as much content as possible. Let's get started with characters. Now here we go. We've got Charlie, Augustus, Veruca, Violet, and Mike. You might know them as the 5 people who won the golden tickets. They are very important, which is why I've listed them here in the first place. Then we've also got Willy Wonka, who is the owner of the chocolate factory. These characters are very key. We need to know them quite well to understand the story. So, we'll start with Charlie. Now, first of all, Charlie, and this is something that you need to write down, it's a characteristic of Charlie, comes from a very poor background. So he is poor. This is very important later when we get to theme. I'll explain it when we get there. But yes, just remember that he comes from a very impoverished place. He doesn't have a lot. But what he does have is what you can call character. He has a very strong character. So, to be more specific, Charlie is very selfless. Selfless. This word means that you care more about the people around you than yourself. So there is also a chapter where the family is starting to struggle and the parents want to give Charlie their portion of the food so that he can get more nutrients. But he refuses and gives the food back to them because he cares about their well-being as well. Now we can continue to Willy Wonka, who is a very eccentric character, which is something you can write down. Very eccentric, which means he talks a lot, and he talks loudly, and he talks very quickly. In the book, we get a description of his movements, which are squirrel-like. So you can just try and imagine this person who's very jittery and moving constantly. Also, something that is very closely linked with Mr. Willy Wonka is the idea of fantasy. Just put a little plus sign there, and we can go fantasy. Now, as you remember from Charlie, he's very poor. The setting around Charlie is described as realistically as possible. It's a very real place. So if you look at Charlie's setting, you can imagine that in the real world that we live in, that could be there. But not Mr. Willy Wonka's setting. The place that he lives is very unreal. It cannot exist. All the magical things happening, the Oompa Loompas who are fictionary, pretty much the entire chocolate factory could not exist in the way that it is described. This is a fantasy. And you can think of it as Willy Wonka's fantasy. Now this character is so amazing that he was able to take his imagination and make his world around him what he wanted it to be. Which is a very important quality which we'll get to in the theme again. So just remember, Willy Wonka is very closely related to fantasy, or the idea of having something that is very difficult to attain. Now we get on to Augustus Gloop. Augustus Gloop is the first person to get a golden ticket. Now the word I want you to write down here is gluttonous. The word gluttonous means that you are addicted to eating. You cannot stop yourself from eating, which is obviously a very horrible quality. So to look at the first characteristics, you'll find that being poor is not something that is fun, but that's something you can't control. However, to be selfless is something you can control, which is a good quality. Willy Wonka as well, to be eccentric is usually seen as a good quality. To be able to live in a fantastic world, that's a good quality. But now all of these characters are, in a way, antagonists. They antagonize our character. They are different to him. So this will be a horrible quality, which will later on lead to Augustus's downfall. We'll do that in the next lesson. We get to Veruca Salt, and the word you can write down here is spoiled. So this girl gets everything she wants, and she gets this by throwing a tantrum. This is horrible because what happens is she'll see something, ask for it. If it is said, no, it's too difficult, she throws a tantrum and her father eventually says, no, it's fine, we'll get it. So this reinforces the idea for Veruca that if I want something, I throw a tantrum. And this is a horrible character trait. You don't want that. Okay, so it's going to lead to you never getting a sense of, I can't have something. You think in your mind you can get whatever you want, which will make you think that you are better than other people, which is also something that Veruca does. Let's continue on to Violet. Now, Violet has a different approach, or her characteristic is different. She is obsessed. And to be specific, she is obsessed about gum. So she is a gum chewer, as the book says, which means she chews it constantly. She has a record for gum chewing, apparently, and she chews the same piece of gum constantly as well, which is very gross. And that is also what the author was trying to do, showing you how an obsession like this can be gross, disgusting. Then we get on to Mike. Mike TV is also a character that is obsessed. But he is obsessed about something else. Television and violence. To be more specific, it's more violence. But he only got the violence as a result of watching television. Also grade 9s, a little bit of a side note, that is an abbreviation. TV is not a word, so try never to use that in your writing. I'm just using it here to conserve space. So yes, Mike is obsessed with watching television, and more specifically, violence on television. So this was back in the day and age when the novel was written, of course, where people said, no, you can't watch certain things, that's why there are age restrictions, and so on. It was very closely thought, or people widely believed, that violence on television would make children more violent, which there are cases that it proves that it is the truth. So Mike is what this is all about. The author is trying to highlight this idea through the character of Mike. Now Mike also has toy pistols that are on his person, which also indicates how he likes shooting them, which is closely related to violence. Also the way that he talks to Mr. Willy Wonka, it's always abrupt and it's always being very rude. He's never saying anything positive or encouraging. It's always a negative comment. Now there are two other characters that we can quickly talk about, but I'm not going to write them on the board. They are less important, but still very important characters. And it is first Mr. Bucket. So Mr. Bucket is the person that is the breadwinner. He gets money in for the family, and that is why they still survive. When he loses his job, then the family starts to become even poorer, and later on they go through a stage of starvation. So his character is quite important because he allows the family to survive. And when he lost his job, it was when the book went into a next gear, so to speak. So his character is very important for that catalyst effect. Now we get on to another character that's very important, which was Grandpa Joe. Now Grandpa Joe is important more so, I'd say, than the other grandparents, because he's the one that supports Charlie in his attempt to live his dreams, to find a golden ticket. The other grandparents also support Charlie and they also love him, but they are not as direct as Grandpa Joe when it comes to this support. If you remember, Grandpa Joe even buys another chocolate bar to try again to get another golden ticket. And that is all we're going to talk about for characters now. We are now going to continue on to setting. Okay. Now, the setting here, as you should know, setting means when and where your story takes place. I hope you know that by now. And here, the when is less important. The story focuses heavily on the where. But the when, if you want to create an image in your mind when you're reading this book, try and think a little bit old modern times. So, not a time where you have a PS4 or anything, that didn't exist yet. Television was just a thing. So imagine that just came out. That's the time period we are looking for. Slightly older, let's say 1960s if you want a specific date. But the where is very important for this book. There are two places that are used to contrast each other. The first one is the house that the buckets live in. Okay, so that's the first place that we need to focus on. The second one is the factory. So let's get started with the first one, just so I can explain why it is important. The bucket's house is described as very tiny. There are two rooms. One room is used for the grandparents to sleep in. There's at least a full bed, but only one. And all four of them are bedridden, so they stay in this bed constantly. Then we get the other room, which is where Charlie and his parents live. They only sleep on the floor, unfortunately, and they have mattresses. That's at least a plus. But it's a very tiny house, and it's not what you would call even middle class. They are poor. So the important thing to remember with the description of this house, you know, like the cold drafts, that's a horrible word. Yeah, cold drafts, and the entire construction of the house, it's all done to show you how poor the family is. Now, on the other side of this coin, we've got the factory, which is a magical place. It is almost as if anything you could have thought up in your mind was put together and created this place. So it's completely different from that of the bucket's house. Now, an easier way to explain this contrast, think of the bucket's house as the realistic world out there. It is realistic to think of people who are poor. It's a real thing that really happens in the world. But things like this is what we want. We want these things to happen. A fantasy world, the factory. So you've got realism and you've got basically fantasy. These two things play off on each other, highlighting the other one or each other. So every time we hear about the factory and we think about the bucket's house, we think how amazing this place is compared to that place. That's what the book is trying to achieve here. And that's all we're going to talk about for setting. You will see this also helps with the next thing we'll talk about, which is theme. Now here, I'm just going to write down the words so you know we're talking about it. As you know, theme is, if you think about it, a moral lesson. And in this case, we have to think what the moral lesson is when we read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And what we learn, and this is what our theme is, it doesn't matter what your circumstances are. The true thing that makes success is your character. If you have a strong character like Charlie does, he is selfless, he helps people around him, then you will achieve success. That is what the book is trying to show you. So our moral lesson there is that even if you are poor, even if you do not have a lot, if you come from a difficult background, that does not matter. In the end, your character will make who you are and what you achieve. Now, you might remember in the previous lesson, I did tell you that theme can be subjective. which means you can have your own opinion about it. And that is true. Same thing for this novel. You might read it and find that obsessive behavior is frowned upon or is horrible for your character. You can see that as a theme. You might find a theme that I can't think of at this point, because you have a certain background, a certain circumstance that allows you to think this way. So again, here it can be subjective. But whenever you have to answer a question in a test, write down the one I just mentioned. It is that your character achieves success, not your circumstances. You will also notice that all the other characters who fail have great circumstances. The one is allowed to eat as much as possible, Augustus Gloop. The other one gets whatever she wants. She's spoiled. The gum chewer chews gum constantly and is allowed to do this. She gets whatever she wants. And then we get to Mike TV, who's able to watch television. In this time, television was seen as a luxury. So he as well has a lot. But all four of them fail. It's just Charlie, with nothing that he owned before, well, his impoverished background, he is the one who prevails. Now, the last thing we'll be talking about is the tone of this novel. So from the previous lesson, you might remember, I told you tone is a type of attitude that the author has. So you might be wondering, what attitude can you find in this novel when you read it? But if you think about it, the author described that Charlie, or well, decided that Charlie would be the better person. And what this does is it's a kind of inspiration that you can come from very small beginnings and achieve success. And that is what our tone focuses on. It is inspirational. It inspires. And that is what our tone is. So when you, for instance, I don't know what your background is, I don't know what your circumstances are, if you read this book, and let's say you are poor, or you do struggle to make, let's say, money, maybe you have different circumstances, if you read this book, you will be able to think, wow, Charlie Bucket, with his great character, was able to get through all of his poverty, all of his problems, and achieved success in the end. Maybe I can do that. So that's what the novel is trying to do, to inspire you to think that just because it's horrible out there doesn't mean it's going to end that way. Okay, and that's where we are going to end the lesson today. As I did say before at the beginning of this lesson, we'll be handling plot on its own in the next lesson. So I will show you chronologically what happens, not in each chapter, but what happens in the chronological story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, how each contestant, sort of gets evicted from this place, and that's where we'll end the lesson for today. Thank you very much, grade 9s, for tuning in to Quarantine English. I do appreciate. I hope this helps, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.